Nim Nim. Birdie Nim Nim. Oh, yes. Happy heresies and welcome to the desert of the real. Just testing things out as people gather into the inner sanctum of Gnosis Facebook group. And I was sort of quoting my favorite actor, Peter Sellers, from the movie The Party. Now that I think about it, that's another movie that could not be made today. Very politically incorrect, but Peter Sellers is brilliant, and Birdie Num Num to you. Yes, yes. Hey, Donovan, Birdie Num Num to you. That should be our call. And of course, the Gnostic call is nipples for men. I'm convinced that's the call of the Gnostic. So as people are going in, why don't we get this party started? If we do get disconnected, I will jump right back in. So don't go anywhere. The reasons being it is a dark and stormy night over here in the countryside of Illinois near a town called Wakanda, near the town of Woodstock where the movie Groundhog Day was filmed. And yes, it's been messing with our internet all evening. And yes, a dark and stormy night. Who said that? That was Edward Bulwer Lytton, I believe, from his, forget what novel was it, but 1830 or so forth. So he came up with that line that many considered the worst line in literature, but he also came out with the line that came out with another line that people consider the best, one of the best lines in literature, and that is the pen is mightier than the sword. And he's also quoted as saying the pursuit of the almighty dollar. So a little duality from Edward Bulwer Lytton, and that includes A Dark and Stormy Night. Of course, some believe that his novels, The Vril, later became inspiration for the Nazi or fascist movement. And Edward was a Rosicrucian, very much into the occult. So that's a little trivia, but the bottom line is if we get disconnected, we'll get right connected. And for YouTube and non-members, I'll eventually get it all spliced in real horror show. So tonight on this dark and stormy night with the birdie num-nums and the nipples for men, I wanted to address a topic that gets, or a polemic, or whatever you want to call it, that gets attached to the Gnostics, the ancient Gnostics, and that is that the Gnostics were world haters. Now, like with many of the issues with the Gnostics is, oh, and if we do get disconnected, somebody text me. Hopefully Vance is around. I got my phone here. I'm going to put it on silent. But the Gnostics were considered world haters. And like many things, that is a sort of straw man. And it's a lot more nuanced than that. I always laugh at the saying the Gnostics are world haters, like they were just sitting around, just like stabbing the earth, all in a group or something, that they were like Charleston Heston in the End of the Planet of the Apes, just going, damn you to hell to the world, because they really had nothing better to do. So, but that is, again, not exactly true. Yes, there is a fly in my room, Don. It's like with this weather, suddenly the insects are coming out, the dogs are nervous, it's storming really hard. So go away, fly. Are you a world hater, fly? But so I think something I need to address, and of course I'd like to mention in our interview with April DeConnick, the Gospel of Judas and the Revolt of the Sethians, which we discussed her book, The 13th Apostle. She does address this. And she addresses this as sort of the idea of world hating, or really being antagonistic towards nature or the body, wasn't that uncommon in ancient times. And it makes perfect sense, because you did have high mortality rates. There was bandits and lions on the roads, and all these dangers. It was hard being a human being. So the ancients sort of had a bad attitude towards nature. And the Gnostics were just part of it. But as always, they dialed it up to 11, and they were more intense. As far as the gods, as April discusses, the truth is that the ancients really weren't that fond of the gods, and this is most ancients. I mean, the analogy she uses is that they saw the gods as this big. Oh my God! Now what is that? My God, that's one of those Illinois stink bugs. Man, they are out to get me. She saw the gods as basically you'd walk by a big pit bull, and this pit bull was protecting you, but you were just sort of giving it treats and going, here, doggy, here, doggy. As long as I give you treats, you might not bite me. This is great. Keep everything protected. That's how basically the ancients saw the gods. And you see this actually done pretty well in this very crappy movie by Oliver Stone, Alexander, in which all the Greeks and the Mesopotamians have Irish accents, except for Angelina Jolie, who has a Russian accent. And it's not a very good movie for a very poignant and, well, game-changing character in history. But the one scene that's pretty cool is when Philip takes Alexander when he's a kid, and he takes him underneath to these caves, and it's a place where he tells him the gods cannot hear, and he confesses that humans hate the gods, but they just have to deal with them and take care of the gods, and somehow the gods are better because if the gods aren't around, then the Titans might come back. So, but he's kind of ambivalent about how bad the Titans are. But again, these gods were seen as these fierce protector, these pit bulls, and that's what you had to do. This is supported very much by, in Bart Ehrman's new book, it's The Triumph of Christianity. Again, in this book, he argues how, basically how Christian arose from the pagan world. And Ehrman argues how in ancient times, worshiping the gods and sacrificing the gods was just part of civic duty. It's not like you cared about the gods, but you just did it to keep the universe going, to keep society going, to keep really everything going. It's like the gods were kind of like, well, they're kind of like our cell phones. It's like our cell phones are great. They allow our world to allow our society to progress, but they're almost like a necessary evil to keep us going. And yeah, we charge our cell phones just like the ancients sacrificed to the gods, and we may look at a cell phone and say, ooh, wow, beautiful. But at the end of the day, it becomes almost it almost traps us, even as it keeps our lives moving forward. So that's how the ancients saw the gods in the Greco-Roman world and so forth. Of course, there were exceptions. There were mystics and shamans who had decided they were going to try to experience something greater. But overall society, that's how they saw the gods, and that's how they really saw the world, not as a friendly place. And in fact, in one of his books, I forgot which book, I don't know if it's Caretakers of the Cosmos, go away fly. Gary Lockman argues how the first, oh my God, this fly is like, fly on the wall. Gary Lockman argues how the first time we have in history somebody talking about going to enjoy nature was in the 13th century by the Italian poet Petrarch. Before that, basically humans were always trying to escape nature or sort of control it because they saw, again, nature as something completely antagonistic. And again, the ancients were not as different all around as the Gnostics. I mean, you have Plotinus, for example, who saw the universe as benign, but at the same time, he had some very unkind things to say about the flesh and getting old and all that. Plato, of course, came up with his line, the body is a tomb and so forth. Even some of the more positive Gnostics, like the Hermetics, you see there's all this poetry about the harmony of the universe and all that, but then they do take some swipes at the flesh, at the world, because ultimately this is not where they want to be. Neither were the Gnostics. And that's, again, where I would, well, that brings me to the Gnostics and what they thought. The Gnostics were, of course, dualists, but they believed in the two-world paradigm. And it was very simple. It's basically, we are in this world, we've been cast in this world, This world is not our home. Our world, or our home, is in another world, a higher world. So basically anything that was temporal, anything that was not eternal, was something that an awakened human should not aspire to become attached to play around with, or play in the laws of this temporality. And hello, Fly. So that's how you basically might assume that the Gnostics were world haters, but that's not exactly it. I mean, there is what was it, Nietzsche, who said that an artist never accepts the world as it is. And that's what the Gnostics were. Again, they dialed it up to 11. They said, no, we realize that we've been cast down to this world. We realize we are strangers to this world, and we have experienced something greater that we are going to work towards always and forever, and hopefully awaken others so that they could share in this. And we are going to expose the world for what it is, which is ultimately a trap, ultimately a place we do not belong, and ultimately something that has been created to, well, take us away from the truth. And this is certainly, and the Gnostics, of course, had different spectrums of their world hating, if you want to call it that, which really isn't world hating. And you wonder about other religions too that also say that, well, our place really is somewhere else. It's nirvana, it's heaven, it's self-actualization, whatever it is. It's somewhere that we are not here. I know people talk about living in the present, but I don't think anybody's ever been in the present, because we're always moving from past to future. Again, as Joseph Campbell said, there's a difference between eternity and the present, which really doesn't exist. So looking at the divergent Gnostic systems, again, you had, before I get down to it, I also talk about something you might, or other people said, well, why are the Gnostic myths so dark? Why are they so visceral, so rated X, with all this violence and raping and archons ejaculating and menstruating to create the animals and the humans, and just dark, very dark stuff? Well, when you think about it, a lot of these creation myths or origin myths can be pretty dark, whether it's Zeus, or whether it's Saturn eating his children, and some of the others. These origin creation myths can be just, very dark, or just very bizarre. And I think that, as Joseph Campbell said, one of the functions of myth is for us to be able to face the horror. As an individual, as a tribe, we must face the horror that is existence. By the horror, the temporality, that which is not eternal. And when we face the horror, we can come together as a tribe, find our relation to the universe, and find some meaning, some purpose, lean on each other, and eventually find these experiences that will make us, as Campbell said, transparent to the transcendent, to go beyond it. So these myths, that's why these myths help us out. These very dark origin creation myths, just like perhaps why horror movies help us out, and other types of stories that are out there. And at the end of the day, myths, especially the Gnostic myths, were supposed to show us existentialist truths in the form of metaphors and stories. Again, to face the horror and what to do about it and not forget about it. The Gnostics, of course, always pretty much more intense, but not that much more intense when you look at other cultures. They just weren't going to compromise. And so you had, for example, the Sethians and the Ophites. Now there was, I think somebody called them, they were the punk rocks of the time. They just weren't going to compromise. They saw reality not as false, but as Gordon White once said, as faked. It was, our reality and our universe was on purpose created to keep the human consciousness or the animal consciousness trapped in delusion, in pain, and in suffering. That was just how the Sethians saw the world, and they weren't going to change their mind. Then you've got sort of softer tones with the Valentinians, and the Valentinians was, I guess you could say, their core doctrine was that what had gone wrong was our perception had gone wrong. They talk about, like in the Gospel of Truth, there was a fog, error came into the universe, and our perception went wrong, and we are sort of in a state of fog, in a state of stupor, and we need to find basically that gnosis, that connection with Christ, or the connection with Sophia, to sort of clear our minds, and then we can see the universe as it is. And at the end of the day, the Valentinians saw the universe as fine, no problems, really no issues, not home, but as something that could that was evolving to, again, to its origin. In fact, in a lot of the Valentinian myths, the demiurge actually assists the world to go back to the source when the fragmentation of the great consciousness begins to go back into it. But in some Valentinian stories, not all get to that. Some people just don't want immortality, they don't want the eternal, and they get to dissolve into the nothingness while everything returns to the source. And then you've got, again, I mentioned the Hermetics and other Alexandrian Gnostics, a lot more positive, but again, like Plotinus, like others, they weren't delusionals like so many religions and people are, that everything was hunky-dory. They did see the body as temporal, as really maybe not a tomb, but a house of pain. They saw that nature was fine, there was a harmony in there, but ultimately it just wasn't our home. And then later on, of course, you go to the Manicheans and the Cathars, and their view of the world was that the universe was basically sort of a perfect balance of light and dark. And there was these two forces always at each other. And the purpose of the individual was to help the light escape animals, plants, and humans, and allow that light to return to its source, and let the darkness stay with whatever it wanted to stay with, the temporality, the nothingness, the emptiness. But ultimately, it's just the way it was. It wasn't evil or good. It was just an interplay of darkness and light. And of course, it's a great metaphor for awakening, for becoming more conscious, and so forth. I don't know how, I'm sure Mani didn't take these myths that literal. I'm sure he knew, again, these were teaching tools and ways to awaken people to, go beyond themselves and sort of look for more permanent methods and higher states of consciousness. So how's everybody doing there in the chat of the inner sanctum of Gnosis? Let me look at my notes. I hope these inks have gone. Let me grab them. So, what do you think? Were the Gnostics world haters? Well, this is where it gets even a little bit more complicated. I remember my first show ever back in 2006. My first guest was Robert Price, and you can still get that interview on YouTube. I think it's Understanding Christian Gnosticism. You can just type it in on YouTube or whatever. But he talked about how even if the Gnostic myths were dark, and they are very dark, and they're very edgy, and their words are less than kind towards the world and so forth in our life, there is an insane and ecstatic joy in their works. And I'm sure many of you read them. It can be very dark, but then it's just beautiful poetry that comes out of them. Even Jesus says in the Gnostic Gospels is different than the Orthodox Jesus. He laughs, he dances, he's comforting his apostles instead of, like in the four Gospels, always talking down to them and snapping at them. He's very friendly and on equal terms with the women followers and so forth. He's a different Jesus. But you see this through the Gnostics. There's an insane joy, like they've found something truly great, like they've been transformed by this great awakening, by this great vision beyond the world, where they make contact with this, again, this God above God, and they are truly transformed, and they're almost like giggling in their clothes, in their shoes. And that's what Robert Price said. In fact, he said that the Gnostics are a perfect parallel to the to the Buddhist Bodhisattva. In fact, Price calls them they were really the only Christian Bodhisattvas, and I always often call them that because, again, they had found something so great that they wanted to share the world. They weren't going to, kill themselves or do anything like those guys with the black Nikes. I already forgot the name of them. I was just talking to Chris Knowles about them the other day. But anyway, they weren't going to kill themselves, and they were going to stay on this earth and share the joy and the gnosis they had found, and they were going to continue having these experiences and attempting to wake others up. Go away, fly, and wake other go. They were going to go waken other people up, and it was just again, they were giddy, they were so happy, they were transformed, they were Christian bodhisattvas. And again, you see these, even in the surly Sethians, you see this beautiful poetry about the lives in the world and how to help others and how there's a light in everything. You see that all throughout different Gnostic gospels throughout time. So this tells you, who they really were. I think it makes sense. When you are finally released from something, you've been trapped. Okay, man, this fly is it's not even, he's aggressive. When you're trapped in something, when you finally escape something, it doesn't matter, it's a job or a relationship and all that. It could be anything. You've awakened to a new reality. You've walked through a tunnel of light, and the decision was just right. It was a perfect decision. What usually happens is that you no longer will feel resentment or anger or anything else towards that thing if you've truly let go. What you'll feel is basically a huge amount of love and compassion, or at the very least, understanding of that place, that person, that thing. And that's what happened with the Gnostics. They were completely released by the bondage of the material world. So they had no choice but to feel a lot of compassion and love for the material world and all the suffering in the world, from the animals to the people and everything else. And I'm sure, like the Valentinians, they had compassion towards the demiurge. I think what's they call it in AA, if you have a resentment towards something, you're allowing them to live rent-free in your head. And that's something that the Gnostics were not experiencing. Again, they had been transformed, as they saw, into beings of light, into Christian bodhisattvas. That always reminds me, as there's an individual called Damien Eccles. He was, I don't know if you guys ever saw the documentary Paradise Lost. That's the one in Memphis where apparently these Satanists brutally murdered these young children, and they and this guy Damien got convicted for murdering these children in a satanistic ritual, and he went to death row. But then later on, after some investigation and some big shots like Eddie Vedder and others really started pushing the issue, he was released after many years in prison in solitary confinement. In fact, he was in solitary confinement so long it damaged his eyes. And now Damien is actually a magician. He writes about pagan and high magic and all that. And I remember in an interview, because I followed this, it was such a ghastly story, and it was so horrible, and I wasn't sure if he'd been guilty and his friends were guilty, and we never really find out who murdered these children. But in an interview, he said, they asked him, well, how can you be at peace after all these years in jail and falsely accused? And he said, well, if I am not at peace, then they have won. They still have trapped me. I am still in that cell, even though my body and my physical form and everything is out here. And I think that's the attitude that the Gnostics had when it comes down to it. I go back to that Christian bodhisattva. When you're released for something, you are going to feel joy, you're going to feel compassion, and you're going to feel, again, you're not going to allow yourself to be in that prison. So that's another attitude or point that I had to say. Of course, it's not all as simple as that, but so at the end of the day, are the Gnostics world haters? I would say yes, they are, and no, they are not. I know, I hope it's not like you guys think it's some chicken shit answer, but I think I've made the argument that it's more complicated than that. Yeah, chicken shit, Abraxas roosterhead. And despite the darkness of the Gnostics and the joy of the Gnostics, there was a lot of reality in what they saw, or realism. They were honest. They weren't, even if they were free from something, they weren't going to let it go. They weren't going to stop calling the world for what it is. So I think at the end of the day, they really did. Probably did hate the world to an extent, and they did have a little bit of anger towards it. I mean, and I think, again, it has to do with the times they lived in, the temporality, the brutality of the Roman Empire, and just the world then, and what it was to a human being. But I don't really see is that changing that much today, where it's not so much that you hate the world, but you are always in a spiritual war against the temporality of the war, and you're not going to compromise, because it will not swallow you whole, but you can go into a state of delusion so fast. It's so easy to be seduced by the golden bars of the world, as it is to turn your back on the suffering of the world, and again allow these powers to live rent-free in your head, and then turn you into what they are, into what the archons want you to be, which is their fury and their anger. And it's not too hard to see that even today with everything we have in this world. I mean, here's an example. I was thinking the other day, do something like go to GoFundMe and just pick any city you want, and then look at what people are posting. And it's heartbreaking. It really is heartbreaking. I mean, there are people who've lost their child and they can't afford a funeral. There are old ladies after a storm, they can't fix their roof and the water's falling. There are people who are getting cancer and they need treatment or something to care for them. I mean, go down GoFundMe and it is truly heartbreaking, and it's infuriating. And I know GoFundMe is obviously an economic backdrop or template, but it just shows you that unfairness of this universe and how suffering is so prevalent so long. And you don't have to, I mean, I just can't turn my back to it. Sometimes and of course, doing something weird like I do, go to a GoFundMe site, at first there is huge pain and there is a sort of anger that comes out to me, but there's also a huge amount of compassion and love for these people, for everybody. And this love goes beyond the GoFundMe to other people around the world. And in a way, I don't want to let go of all of this, because I feel more real and more alive, like the Gnostics did. It's like that scene in Annie Hall, when Annie Hall is like asking Woody Allen, why is he so neurotic and paranoid? And like the ancient Gnostics, and Woody Allen's like, well, if there's one child starving in the world, I can't relax. And I was like, well, that was probably the attitude of the ancient Gnostics. That's probably the attitude of anybody who has gnosis. How can you relax when somebody is suffering, when one person is suffering? And even beyond that, I mean, I can look out there right now at nature, and I know that squirrel isn't there for my own Disney entertainment. That animal, it is looking for food because it's going to get cold and it could die very quickly. Same with the deer I see. And with the predators, I see coyotes here, and I know they are one miss kill or hunt from starving to death, and their cubs starving to death and getting disease. So nature is completely subjective. Yes, as the Gnostics would say, there is divinity in there, but that divinity is trapped in a lot of suffering. And how can we ease the suffering? How can we bring out the light? And usually it just starts with the least of your brothers. Charity begins at work, helping others in very little ways. And when you read a lot of the Gnostic Gospels or stories, they were very charitable. In fact, individuals like the Manicheans and the Cathars, they were beloved where they went. These world haters, they would go to these towns and cities, and the communities loved them. I mean, the Catholics in southern France help the Cathars whenever the Crusaders were trying to kill them in the 13th century. And this happened with the Manicheans, who were successful because they were really very compassionate, very nice, very reasonable, and beyond the world hating and their dark myths, they just made connections with people, and they're very charitable to the communities they went. It was unfortunately, the secular and religious powers around, whether there was in Asia Buddhist or Persian or Jewish or Christian, who decided that this sort of anarchist, individualistic thinking of letting people see the world as it was and finding their own inner light was just not acceptable. And you even have Plotinus, going back to Plotinus. Plotinus he talks about how the Sethians, the early Sethians who were going to his university, again, they were good people in his university. You never hear about Gnostics being arrested for weird things until the religion became illegal. Never hear about that, but the Sethians were attending his university. Plotinus calls them friends. They are his Christian friends. Plotinus talks about how the Sethians are complaining that there's not enough social programs in the empire, and the poor and the sick and all that. And Plotinus, of course, he takes his trickle-down theology about how everything emanates from the divine down. So this is the natural order thing. I mean, in the East, they do this thing, oh, this is karma, and this is God's plan, so let's not worry too much. Let's let things work out. We'll make the best of it. This is just the way the universe is. And then he tells the Sethians, why don't you just get that, go out the door and don't let the door split you where God hit you on the way out, or hit you where Zeus split you. So that's it for the Gnostics. That's basically that's been basically their kismet. It's trying to awaken people, trying to remind people not to get comfortable with the world and go with this is it's a harmony and it's great and we are the world and the circle of life, even though it's more like the circle jerk of life with nature killing off and all the suffering. And let's just do better. Let's ask deeper questions. Let's help out where we can. And again, Gnostic Gospels are full of quotes, poetry about love, about helping others. It's all there, but they also wanted you to wake up to the horror of the world and why do men have nipples? So Birdie Num Num.